Picture this. It is 1923, Germany. A man walks into a bakery with a bag, not a wallet, a bag, full of cash. He sets it on the counter. The baker counts it out slowly, 80,000 marks, for one loaf of bread. The baker looks up and says quietly, "If you come back tomorrow, bring more. Same loaf will cost you 160,000. He had spent his entire adult life doing everything right. Bonds, bank deposits, every responsible thing a man of his generation was supposed to do. His account balance never moved. The numbers were always there, exactly where he left them. But every single week, those same numbers bought a little less, then a lot less, then almost nothing. He did not lose his money to bad decisions. He lost it to something quieter, and in many ways, far more dangerous. Now just a few streets away lived his neighbor, a man he had known for years. Nothing flashy about him, nothing particularly special. But this neighbor owned farmland just outside the city. And when everything started unraveling, the currency, the banks, the trust in all of it, one thing stayed stubbornly true: people still needed to eat. His land still produced. His prices moved with reality instead of against it. And by the time the dust settled, this man, this quiet, unremarkable neighbor, was wealthier than he had ever been in his life. It was simply what they held. My name is Mila, and I'm obsessed with the small moves and hidden nuances that build real wealth. Today, we are going through 5 assets that have historically gone to zero during economic stress, and 5 that have held up. Not to frighten you, to sharpen how you think about what you actually own. Let's get into it, but let us go back for a second, because you might still be sitting with that image: a grown man walking into a bakery carrying a bag of cash just to buy bread, 80,000 marks. And the baker looking up and saying, "Come back tomorrow, bring 160,000. Same loaf." How does that happen? How does a currency people trusted, saved, and built entire lives around? How does it move that fast? It does not happen overnight. It happens in stages. And each stage triggers the next. It starts with overspending. A government spends more than it earns and borrows to cover the gap. The borrowing becomes unsustainable, so they start creating money to cover it. More money enters the system, but the same amount of goods exist. So prices start climbing. People notice. Trust in the currency weakens. Those who can start moving their money out. The government panics and responds with controls, withdrawal limits, capital restrictions, account freezes. And by the time the average person fully understands what is happening, the damage is already deep. Overspending, borrowing, money creation, inflation, loss of confidence, controls, collapse. One leads to the next, every single time. And what gets destroyed in that sequence, and what survives it, depends entirely on what you are holding when it begins. So let us get into the assets themselves. And we are going to look at this in 2 halves. First, 5 assets that have historically gone to zero, or close enough to zero that the difference barely matters. Then, 5 that have held up. Not perfectly, not without volatility, but held up in a way that the others simply did not. And I want you to listen to the first half carefully, because almost every asset on this list is going to sound familiar. Some of them are going to sound responsible. That is exactly the point. Here is the uncomfortable truth about the assets that tend to fail during economic collapse. They do not fail because people were reckless with them. They fail because people trusted them completely. These are the assets that look like safety, that generations were taught to rely on, and that a collapsing system quietly hollowed out from the inside. The pattern is always the same. The number stays, the value leaves. Let us start with the most common one. An asset 1 that went to zero, cash, savings, in a failing currency. The first asset that has historically gone to zero is the one most people feel safest holding. Cash. Not cash spent recklessly, not cash gambled away. Cash saved deliberately, carefully, responsibly. Sitting in a bank account, growing slowly, doing exactly what it is supposed to do. And on paper, it looks fine. The number is there, it does not disappear, nobody steals it. But here is what most people do not fully understand about cash savings. The number staying the same is not the same as the value staying the same. In Zimbabwe in the late 2000s, inflation reached a point so extreme, the government eventually printed a $100 trillion note, 100 trillion, and it could not buy a bus ticket. People who had saved their entire lives in Zimbabwean dollars watched those savings become functionally worthless, not because the number changed, but because what that number could actually purchase collapsed completely. Venezuela tells the same story a different way. Between 2016 and 2019, inflation hit over 1 million%. A person who had diligently saved the equivalent of a year's salary watched it lose almost all of its real value within months. The account still existed. The money was technically still there, but the actual ability to buy food, medicine, pay rent, hollowed out almost entirely. Now, before you think this only happens in struggling economies, the US dollar, the most trusted, most powerful currency in the world, lost 8.5% of its purchasing power in 2022 alone, the highest single-year drop in 40 years. And since 1913, it has lost over 96% of its purchasing power in total. Not through collapse, not through crisis, just slowly, quietly, persistently. The number staying the same is not the same as the value staying the same. In a currency crisis, that gap closes fast. In a stable economy, it closes slowly, but it closes either way. Cash is not inherently bad. Every functioning financial life needs a liquidity. But cash held entirely in one currency with no hedge, no diversification, no store of value alongside it. That is not safety. That is exposure dressed up as caution. Asset 2 that went to zero, long-term government bonds. The second asset is one that has historically been sold to people as the responsible alternative to cash. Safer than stocks, backed by the government, predictable returns. And in stable times, that is largely true. But in a collapsing economy, government bonds reveal a flaw that most people never see coming. Here is how they work. You lend the government money today. They promise to pay you back later. With interest, a fixed number, agreed up front, and that is exactly the problem. Because they will honor that number. They almost always do. But while that number stays fixed, the value of the currency it is denominated in can collapse entirely around it. So you receive every single payment exactly as promised. And it buys you almost nothing. This is precisely what happened in Weimar Germany. Bondholders were paid back in full, every mark accounted for, every payment delivered on schedule. But by the time those payments arrived, the mark had been so thoroughly destroyed by hyperinflation that the money was essentially worthless. People who had lent the government real value, real purchasing power, were handed back paper. Technically whole, practically wiped out. This is the quiet danger of fixed nominal promises. They protect the number. They cannot protect the value. And the longer the bond, the worse the exposure. A 30-year bond issued in a stable economy can mature in a very different one. You are not just lending money. You are betting that the currency it is denominated in will still mean something decades from now. History suggests that is not always a safe bet. Asset 3 that went to zero, fixed pensions and annuities. This one hits differently because it does not affect people who took risks. It affects people who spent their entire lives being told they had done everything right. Think about Social Security, or a government teacher's pension, or a military retirement payment. You spend decades working, contributing, waiting, and in return, you are guaranteed a specific amount every single month for the rest of your life. Not linked to markets, not linked to inflation, a fixed number. The same payment every month, forever. In stable times, that predictability feels like the ultimate security, like the finish line you have been running toward your whole career. But that fixed number is exactly where the problem hides. Picture a retired school teacher in Weimar Germany, 30 years in the classroom, contributing faithfully every single month. And when she retired, her payment arrived, on time, every month, without fail. But as hyperinflation accelerated, that same payment that once covered her rent, her groceries, her basic dignity, started covering less, then much less, then almost nothing. She was not late on a payment. She was not penalized. She received every single mark she was promised. But by the time those marks arrived, they could barely buy a loaf of bread. The payment survived. Her security did not. And this is not just a Weimar story. Research published in 2025 found that a $100 Social Security benefit in 1975 has the purchasing power of only $16.40 today. The checks arrived, every single one, but 84 cents of every dollar was quietly erased by inflation over 50 years. That is the hidden flaw in any fixed income promise. The number is protected. Everything around that number, what it can actually buy, what life it can actually fund, is not. A fixed income in an unfixed economy is not security. It is just a number that arrives on time. Asset 4, that went to zero, large bank deposits. This one is specifically about what happens to your money in the bank when an economic crisis hits the banking system. In 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, President Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday right here in the United States. For an entire week, Americans had no access to their banks whatsoever. They could not withdraw their money, transfer it, or even make deposits. 37 states had already begun imposing their own withdrawal restrictions before the federal order even came through. And when it was all over, 4,000 banks never reopened. The money people had deposited into them was simply gone. That was not Lebanon. That was not Cyprus. That was America. Because here is what most people do not think about. The bank feels like the safest place your money can possibly be. And in normal times, it largely is. But when a government runs out of options, when debt becomes unsustainable, and confidence in the whole system starts to collapse, the banking system is usually where ordinary people feel it first. And when that happens, banks and governments do not always let you access your money freely. They freeze it. They limit it. Sometimes they take a portion of it outright, a process called a bail-in, to stabilize the institution that is holding it. And the pattern has repeated itself in living memory. Cyprus in 2012 and 2013, caught in the European sovereign debt crisis, froze bank accounts overnight. When the dust settled, depositors with over 100,000 euros in certain banks had a significant portion of their savings permanently converted into bank shares in the very institution that had just failed them. Lebanon followed the same path. As the economy collapsed, currency crisis, government debt default, and banking crisis all hitting simultaneously, banks began quietly restricting withdrawals, then formally freezing accounts. Those who held dollars specifically because they did not trust the pound watched banks force conversions back into pounds at official rates that bore no resemblance to reality. Different countries, different decades, same mechanism. The money was there. They just could not get to it. And in a crisis, money you cannot access is not meaningfully different from money you do not have. Your bank account is not a vault. It is a promise, and promises have conditions. Asset 5, that went to zero. One system concentration. The last asset on this side of the list is a little different. It is not a single thing you hold. It is a way of holding everything. One system concentration. All your wealth in one currency, one country, one banking system, one set of institutions, one government, one set of rules that can change overnight. And this is where the previous 4 assets start to connect. Because if your cash is in one currency and that currency collapses, you saw what happens. If your bonds are denominated in that same currency, you saw what happens. If your pension is paid out in that currency, you saw what happens. If your savings are held in the banks of that same country, you saw what happens. Now imagine all 4 of those things happening to you at the same time, in the same place, with no exit. That is what one system concentration looks like when it goes wrong. Argentina has lived this lesson repeatedly. In 2001, the Argentine peso collapsed after years of being pegged to the US dollar. The government froze bank accounts, forcibly converted dollar deposits into pesos, and restricted withdrawals. People who had kept everything, their savings, their investments, their retirement, entirely within the Argentine financial system had no exit, no hedge, no alternative. Everything they owned was subject to the same set of rules, controlled by the same government, denominated in the same collapsing currency. The Argentines who fared better were those who had diversified outside the system. Dollar holdings, property in other markets. Assets that sat outside the reach of a single government's emergency decisions. This is what concentration risk actually means. It is not about how much you own. It is about how many different ways you can lose it all at once. Diversification is often talked about in terms of stocks and bonds. But the deeper diversification, the one that matters most in a real crisis, is across systems, across currencies, across geographies, across sets of rules. Because when one system breaks, everything inside it breaks together. If any of that felt uncomfortably familiar, that is not a reason to panic. It is a reason to think more clearly. Because the assets that held up through these same crises were not complicated. They just shared a different set of qualities. And that is what we are looking at now. Now, here's where the story changes. Because across every crisis we just covered, Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Cyprus, Lebanon, Argentina, there were people who made it through, not because they were richer, not because they had inside information, not because they saw it coming before everyone else, but because what they owned had something the other assets did not: independent value, not a promise, not a number on a statement, not a government's word, something that held its usefulness, its scarcity, or its ability to generate real value, regardless of what the currency around it was doing. These are the 5 assets that history shows up time and time again on the right side of a crisis. Asset 1 that survived: agricultural land. Remember the neighbor from the beginning of this video? The one who owned farmland just outside the city? While the man who had saved his whole life in bonds and bank deposits watched his wealth dissolve, his neighbor was not just surviving, he was holding. And in some cases, he was thriving. That was not luck. That was the nature of agricultural land. And before we go back to Weimar, this happened right here in the United States too. During the high inflation years of the 1970s, farmland was one of the strongest performing assets in the country. The average value went from $197 per acre in 1970 to $737 by 1980, averaging more than 10% growth every single year through the entire decade. While inflation was quietly hollowing out the purchasing power of cash savings, agricultural land was moving in the opposite direction. Because when prices rise, what the land produces becomes more valuable too. It reprices with reality instead of against it. Weimar confirmed the same truth on a more extreme scale. While city dwellers were scrambling to spend their wages before the money lost value by afternoon, farmers and agricultural landowners had something the currency could not touch: food, real output, things people needed regardless of what the mark was worth that day. Here is what makes agricultural land fundamentally different from every asset we just covered. It does not derive its value from a promise. A government cannot print more of it. A central bank cannot devalue it. And it never stops producing something the world needs. In a crisis, people stop trusting paper. They never stop needing to eat. That is why agricultural land has sat on the right side of almost every major economic crisis in recorded history. Not because it is glamorous, because it is real. Asset 2 that survived: gold. Gold is probably the oldest financial argument in human history. And it keeps winning. Not because it is exciting, not because it generates income or pays dividends or builds anything, but because of one quality that has proven almost impossible to replicate across centuries of economic chaos. It is no one's promise. You cannot print gold. You cannot create it out of thin air. No government can devalue it with a policy decision. No central bank can produce more of it overnight. It exists completely independently of any financial system. And in a world where those systems are under pressure, that independence becomes extraordinarily valuable. Here is the contrast that makes this concrete. The US dollar has lost over 96% of its purchasing power since 1913. That is the world's most powerful reserve currency, managed by one of the most sophisticated central banks in history, quietly losing almost all of its real value over a century. Now, look at gold over that same period. In 1913, gold was priced at around $20 an ounce. Today, it trades at over $4,000. While the dollar was losing 96% of its purchasing power, gold was doing the opposite. Not perfectly, not in a straight line, but directionally, consistently, over the long arc of history, it held. And the moments where gold moved most dramatically were exactly the moments where the dollar came under the most pressure. When Nixon ended the gold standard in 1971 and the dollar was left unanchored, inflation surged. Gold went from $35 an ounce in 1971 to nearly $800 by the end of 1979. While cash savings were being hollowed out and bonds were delivering negative real returns, gold moved in the opposite direction. The worse the dollar performed, the stronger gold became. Central banks around the world understand this. They have been quietly accumulating gold for years, not as a speculative bet, as a hedge against the very system they operate inside. Gold is not a get-rich asset. It is a stay-whole asset. It does not grow your wealth in normal times the way productive assets do, but in the specific moments this video is about, When currencies are failing and systems are breaking, that is exactly the quality you want. Asset 3, that survived, businesses with pricing power. Think about the last time there was serious economic turbulence in your area. Think about which businesses stayed open, which ones had lines out the door regardless of what was happening, and which ones quietly closed, not because people stopped liking them, but because the economics stopped working. The grocery store stayed open, the pharmacy stayed open, the gas station stayed open, the gym down the street closed, the boutique restaurant closed, the luxury retailer closed. That pattern is not random, and it is not just about what people want. It is about what people cannot stop buying, and whether the business selling it can reprice fast enough to stay ahead of what inflation is doing to their costs. This is the third asset that has historically survived economic stress. Not just any business. Ownership in businesses with pricing power, companies that sell essentials people cannot stop buying and can adjust their prices fast enough to stay ahead of a deteriorating currency. Because here is what pricing power actually means in a crisis. It is not just about being able to charge more, it is about selling something people need regardless of the economic environment, and being able to move your prices fast enough to match reality. You need both. Essential demand alone is not enough. A business that sells something people need but cannot reprice quickly will still get squeezed out. Brazil proved this in real time over a decade of hyperinflation that averaged above 100% annually between 1980 and 1994. Supermarkets changed their prices every single day, sometimes more than once. They survived because people kept walking through the door, and they could reprice fast enough to stay profitable. One beer manufacturer stopped making beer entirely. Not because people stopped wanting beer, but because brewing takes months. And by the time the product was ready to sell, the cost of everything that went into making it had already multiplied beyond what the market could bear. The production cycle was too long to keep pace with the inflation. Essential demand, pricing agility, you need both. In any serious inflationary environment, the businesses that hold up are the ones selling things people keep buying no matter what, and adjusting fast enough to stay ahead of the curve. Owning a piece of that kind of business, through stocks, through a private stake, or through any form of equity, is owning something that earns in real terms. Not in promises, not in fixed numbers, in actual value that moves with the world around it. Asset 4, that survived. Foreign currency and foreign system assets. Everything we have covered so far points to one underlying vulnerability: concentration. All your wealth in one currency, one country, one system, one set of rules that can change overnight. The fourth asset that has historically held up is really the solution to that vulnerability: foreign currency. Assets held in a different system. Wealth that sits outside the reach of any single government's emergency decisions. Argentina in 2001 makes this point with painful clarity. The government had pegged the peso to the US dollar 1-to-1, meaning every peso in circulation needed a dollar to back it. But Argentina had been borrowing heavily and spending far beyond what it could sustain. When it became clear the government was running out of the dollars needed to hold that peg together, confidence collapsed overnight. Everyone rushed to convert their pesos to dollars at once. The government froze bank accounts to stop the hemorrhage, limiting withdrawals to just $250 a week. And when the peg finally broke, the peso lost nearly 3/4 of its value within months. Anyone whose wealth was entirely inside the Argentine financial system had no exit, no alternative, no second door, but Argentines who had been quietly holding US dollars, and many had, precisely because they did not fully trust the peso even during the stable years, had something the collapse could not touch. Not because dollars are perfect, but because they were outside the system that was breaking down. This is what foreign currency and foreign system assets actually provide. Not guaranteed returns, not immunity from all risk, but optionality. A portion of your wealth operating under a different set of rules, in a different currency, subject to a different government's decisions. In a crisis, optionality is one of the most valuable things you can own. The people who had it in Argentina had choices. The people who did not had only one path. And that path was closing fast. Asset 5. That survived: real estate with real utility. The fifth and final asset on this side of the list is one that almost everyone has a relationship with: whether they own it or pay someone else who does, real estate, but not all real estate. That distinction matters enormously, and history makes it very clear. In 2008, right here in the United States, real estate was at the center of one of the worst financial crises in modern history. Prices collapsed, millions lost their homes, entire neighborhoods were devastated. So, how can real estate appear on the list of assets that historically survive economic stress? Because what collapsed in 2008 was not real estate broadly. It was speculative real estate. Properties bought purely to flip. Vacation homes. Second and third properties purchased on the assumption that prices would keep rising forever. By 2006, nearly 40% of homes being purchased in the U.S. were not intended as primary residences. They were bets. And when the bet failed, they failed completely with it. But here is what did not fail. Rental demand. People still needed somewhere to live. In high-demand areas, properties that provided real shelter to real people retained underlying value even as speculative prices collapsed all around them. Investors who converted foreclosed homes to rentals after the crash actually put a floor under falling prices. Because the demand for shelter never went away. Even in the worst housing crisis in a generation, the need for a roof over your head did not disappear. And this is exactly what the post-Soviet transition confirmed on a more extreme scale. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the financial system Russians had built their lives around disintegrated almost overnight. Soviet-era savings, the responsible, steady, do-the-right-thing savings that generations had accumulated, were worth close to nothing by the late 1990s. Hyperinflation wiped them out. Financial assets essentially evaporated. But people who held physical property, apartments, buildings, real structures in real places, had something that could not be inflated away. You cannot print more apartments. You cannot devalue a building out of existence. And as Russia transitioned to a market economy, private housing grew from less than 50% of national income in 1990 to 250% by 2008. The people who held physical real estate through that chaotic transition came out the other side with something real. The people who held financial savings largely did not. That is the distinction this entire asset rests on: real estate with real utility, a place people need to live, in a location people want to be, generating income from that most basic human need, has a floor that speculative real estate does not. The currency around it can change, the economy around it can contract, but people still need somewhere to sleep. That quality, utility that does not disappear when a currency does, is exactly what connects this final asset to every other one on this list. So here's the question this video was really building toward the entire time. Not what happened in Weimar Germany, not what happened in Argentina or Lebanon or post-Soviet Russia, but what is happening in your own financial life right now. Because the patterns we just covered are not ancient history. They are a recurring blueprint. And the uncomfortable truth is that most people, including smart, hardworking, financially responsible people, are more exposed to some of these vulnerabilities than they realize. Not because they made bad decisions, but because they never had a framework to assess what kind of exposure they actually carry. So let us build that framework right now. 5 questions. Honest answers only. The first question is, how much of your wealth depends on a single currency? Not just your cash savings, your pension, your retirement account, your bonds, your salary. If the answer is almost all of it, you are carrying more concentration risk than you may have recognized before today. The second question is, how much of your wealth is a fixed nominal promise? A number that someone has guaranteed to pay you in the same currency, at the same amount, regardless of what inflation does between now and then. Fixed pensions, annuities, long-term bonds. If that number is high, your financial security may be more fragile than it appears on paper. The third question is, do you own anything with independent utility? Something that produces real value, something that does not rely on a government's promise or a currency's stability to be worth something. Agricultural land, property-generating rental income, equity in a business with pricing power, gold as a store of value. Anything that would still matter if the system around it came under serious pressure. The fourth question is all of your wealth inside one system, one country, one banking system, one set of rules? Or do you have any geographic diversification, any assets that sit outside the reach of a single government's emergency decisions? And the fifth question, And this one is perhaps the most clarifying of all. If inflation doubled from here, would that help you or hurt you? If the honest answer is hurt, you are likely carrying more paper promise exposure than real asset exposure. And that gap is worth closing. You do not need to answer all 5 of these questions perfectly. Nobody does. The point is not to build a bunker or panic. The point is to think more clearly about where your vulnerabilities actually are and start making intentional decisions about how to reduce the ones that matter most to you. Now, let us go back to where we started. 2 men, same street, same country, same collapse happening all around them. One had done everything right: bonds, bank deposits, a lifetime of responsible saving. And when the crisis hit, his numbers were all still there, every single one. But the value behind those numbers had been destroyed, not by recklessness, not by bad decisions, by the nature of what he held. His neighbor had land, something that produced, something independent, something the currency could not touch. And when the dust settled, he was not just intact. He was in a position of quiet, unexpected strength. The difference was not intelligence, it was not effort, it was not luck. It was simply what they held. Wealth is not just what grows in good times, it is what survives the bad ones. Think about what you hold. If this video gave you a new way of thinking about what you own and why it matters, please share it with someone you think needs to hear it. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is a good time. I put out videos like this regularly, and I do not want you to miss them. And always remember, luxury is easier when your money's organized. I will see you in the next one, and I love you.